Six Flags Over Texas has one of the richest histories of any theme park in North America, but time has not been kind to this legendary park, and things are not the same as they once were. This is the rise and fall of Six Flags Over Texas. It all started with one Angus G. Wynn Jr. Wynn was an oil man and a real estate developer in Texas during the 1950s and was making some pretty good money. He was even wealthy enough to take a trip out to the newly opened Disneyland in California. Little did Wynn know, of course, that this trip would change his life forever. Seeing what Walt and the Disney company were able to make, Wynn came to the conclusion that there needed to be a similar attraction in his home state of Texas. So, in 1959, Wynn got together with the Great Southwest Corporation and a few investors from New York and developed the plans for the park. They all came to the agreement to build the park as sort of a temporary moneymaker so that other projects in Texas could be funded. On August 5th, 1961, those plans finally came to fruition and Six Flags Over Texas opened in Arlington, Texas. You see, Wynn loved his home state of Texas, so he knew that he wanted to have the park at least have something to do with the great history of Texas. In fact, the name Six Flags Over Texas is actually in reference to the 6 different nations that have governed Texas throughout history. These nations, of course, included Spain, France, Mexico, the Republic of Texas, the United States of America, and, get ready to oof hard at this one, the Confederate States of America. The park would have a land for each one of these nations to complete the overall theme of the park. Another one of the major features the park opened with was the pay one price model, which allowed guests to experience all of the rides and attractions for just one single price of admission. Of course, nowadays, almost every major theme park uses this model, but at the time, many parks, including Disneyland, were still using the ticket model, a system in which you would pay for each ride or attraction you wanted to experience individually instead of just paying a simple admission price. To everyone's surprise, the park's attendance shattered expectations in its first season with over 550,000 visitors, which is an attendance that even some well-known parks today would die to have. As a result of this huge attendance, plans for the park quickly changed. The parties involved decided that the park would no longer be a temporary fixture, but would instead indeed be here to stay. The first decade of operation would be a spectacular one, with classic attractions opening such as El Aserradero, which means the sawmill in Spanish, and is a log flume that is still operating today, and the Runaway Mine Train, which was the park's second roller coaster. Unlike their first roller coaster, however, Runaway Mine Train is still entertaining guests today. Also around this time, Hanna-Barbera recorded parts for an opening theme song for their new show The Banana Splits in the park. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the General Sam Houston, the locomotive that opened with the park. You see, General Sam Houston was a Texas state governor as well as the first president of the Republic of Texas. And the General Sam Houston was first built here at Six Flags Over Texas to run on these here tracks.
Now she's a century old and she spends all of her time playing on these here tracks at Six Flags Over Texas. Son, I build train.
With all the good publicity and additions the park was getting, the park's yearly attendance grew close to 2 million visitors. However, there would be some bad news within the decade as the original owner of the park, Angus G. Wynn Jr., would sell off the park to a Dallas investor named Jack Knox. Then the 1970s came and 2 new coasters were added, the first of which was Big Bend. Big Bend was only open for 8 years, and many people might see this as an indicator that it was a bad ride. But that actually wasn't the case. You see, the ride didn't have restraints, didn't have lap bars, didn't have seat belts. The manufacturers assumed that the G-forces from the ride would be enough to keep people in their seats. However, one day somebody had the smart idea of standing up on the coaster. Luckily they didn't die, and were only severely injured. After this, the park would add seatbelts, but guests knowing the full story started creating myths about the ride with tales of many riders dying and the coaster train jumping off the tracks. Of course, none of these tales were true, but it made the Big Bend a legend, and would instantly give bragging rights to anyone who rode the ride and lived to tell the tale. Interestingly enough though, the ride was not removed due to any of this, but was instead removed because it broke down often, and was just a nightmare for mechanics to fix. The other coaster that opened this decade was Shockwave, which was a looping coaster manufactured by the same people who made the Big Bend. And Over Texas contracted them to build this despite already knowing the mechanical issues that Big Bend was experiencing. The most surprising part about this, however, is that the ride is still operating today and is highly regarded as a classic coaster of the park. Towards the end of this decade, in 1978, they reported that they have gotten 30 million visitors all time to the park. Following this, the park would continue to add major additions every few years as the park continued to grow in the 80s and the early 90s. Some major things that happened during this time was the beginning of Fright Fest and Holiday in the Park events, as well as 4 new coasters including the Texas Giant. However, after over 30 years of success and consistent growth, Six Flags would be bought by Time Warner in 1993. Nothing really good or bad happened under Time Warner's short ownership, as Time Warner sold Six Flags off to Premier Parks in 1998. And this is where things began to go downhill for Over Texas. Around the time of the Premier Parks acquisition, Over Texas would begin to add attractions that strayed far away from its original theme, with rides opening based on characters from DC Comics and an entire land themed to Gotham City. It really wasn't Six Flags Over Texas anymore. I mean, they were adding these rides in sections of the park that didn't even make sense. For instance, one of the new rides they added, Tony Hawk's Big Spin, now known as Pandemonium, opened in the Boomtown section of the park, which is supposed to represent the towns that were built around oil wells during Texas's oil boom era. I don't think skateboarding or Tony Hawk has anything to do with that. Over Texas wouldn't begin getting the yearly additions that all Six Flags parks get now until 2015, as there were many years where either nothing new opened or an old attraction was renovated and then reopened. The only new unique ride of major significance that has opened at the park in the last 10 plus years has been the new Texas Giant, as that was the first RMC hybrid coaster ever built. Now, as we all know, the coaster as well as RMC was well received, but let's be honest, the reason they chose Over Texas to be the lab rat for this unproven company was because they truly did not care if it failed. All they cared about was the fact that they could build a quote-unquote new coaster for a pretty low price without having to completely demolish the old ride that used to be there. We can see how little they care about this park today through the park's other recent additions as well. Cheap clones, gimmicky flat rides, and an unfathomable amount of DC branded attractions. A lot of Six Flags parks can say they're getting the same junk as well, but it's surprising to see Six Flags give the same treatment to the park that they literally got their name from and started this whole operation. We know this park is capable of great things. I mean, they had a yearly park attendance of over 2 million in the 60s, which even by today's standards is pretty good. So why then does Six Flags treat Over Texas the same way they treat other parks who have already begun to reach their cap for growth? Well, for one, they are landlocked. They have highways and stadiums on all sides of them. So in recent years, Six Flags has just been either getting rid of old rides and replacing them, or squeezing in flat rides wherever they can. And quite frankly, I've found what they've been doing recently to be the lazy way about going about doing this. I mean, when the going gets tough, you gotta get creative. You can't just sit back and play it easy. You'll never win the game playing like that. So essentially what I'm saying is you gotta get creative when using this land. You can't just try and squeeze in garbage flat rides wherever you can. You gotta figure out better ways to use this land to fit in more quality rides and not more rides in general. And to be honest, I think these actions are a product of Six Flags' business model where they give each park a new ride every year. If that wasn't the case, they could take more time to figure out how to better restructure the park. With the history that comes behind this park, it's essentially a historical landmark in the theme park world. So it's a shame to see Six Flags treat it the way they have. I really hope that they start to give it a little bit more attention. In 2020, they're supposed to get a Mack Power Splash, which is nice, but my concern is that they're going to market it as the park's newest coaster, which technically speaking it is, but I do feel like it's going to be an excuse for them to not really give the park anything good for another 5-10 years. So let's hope that's not the case. So once again, Six Flags, the ball is in your court. Do something great with this park and bring it back to the glory days. Let me know what park you want me to talk about next in these kind of history rant style videos, and I'll see you all next time.